All right, let's talk about some specific organisms that plants have symbiotic relationships with or are dependent on. The first big category that they have relationships with are bacteria, and the second big category is fungi. So one of the types of bacteria that they are dependent on would be what we would big category Rhizobacteria. Rhizo means root, so these are just bacteria that either live on the roots of plants or inside the roots of plants. So the ones that live outside the roots would be the free-living ones, and the other ones would be ones that live inside root nodules. So Rhizobacteria is a general category of bacteria. It's not a specific phylogenetic group of bacteria. So these root-associated bacteria do a lot of things for the plants. One of the things they do is they protect the plants from harmful bacteria that would want to damage the plants. They increase nutrient availability, and they also help convert nitrogen into forms that the plants can use. If you remember, nitrogen is the third most needed nutrient after carbon dioxide and water. Nitrogen is next. Plants cannot make nitrogen or DNA, or they can't make proteins or DNA without nitrogen. And these bacteria that affect the state that nitrogen is in and whether it's available to plants or not, these are part of the nitrogen cycle. So all the nutrients have a cycle. There's a carbon cycle and a water cycle, and there's a nitrogen cycle. And nitrogen in the atmosphere, 78% of our atmosphere is gaseous nitrogen. That form of nitrogen is not available to plants or most organisms on Earth to be used. But there are bacteria in the soil that can convert that nitrogen into nitrate or ammonia. And plants can use both of those forms of nitrogen. So here's a little bit of the nitrogen cycle, the part that happens in the soil. So let's start over here. So we have gaseous nitrogen in our atmosphere, N2. Nitrogen is triple bonded together because nitrogen can make 3 bonds. So if we have N2, they're triple bonded together. This is not available to plants, but there are nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil that can turn this into ammonia. Ammonia also comes from the decay of organic matter. It's a product of a different type of bacteria that are breaking down rotting, dead organic matter. That also produces ammonia. Plants can use ammonia. Plants can absorb the NH4 ion directly. There are other bacteria in the soil, nitrifying bacteria, that turn ammonia into nitrite or nitrate, and this can also be used by the plants. There are also natural sources of nitrate, but it's not enough for the nutrition of plants. The bacteria are an essential part of this process. And then there are other bacteria that take nitrate and turn it back into gaseous nitrogen. And this plus photosynthesis is the reason that our atmosphere is almost 100% oxygen and gaseous nitrogen. That the 78% nitrogen gas is coming from bacteria. Bacteria are constantly replenishing the nitrogen in our atmosphere, and plants and other photosynthetic organisms like cyanobacteria are constantly replenishing the oxygen. Our atmosphere is constantly gassing out into outer space, and one of the reasons that we have such a dense atmosphere is thanks to the activity of bacteria releasing nitrogen gas into the atmosphere, and photosynthetic plants and other organisms that are releasing oxygen into the atmosphere. And that comprises most of our atmosphere today. So there are a specific group of bacteria that are called Rhizobium, and the genus is Rhizobium, and there are several different species. And Rhizobium are alpha proteobacteria, and this group of bacteria might sound familiar to you. Alpha proteobacteria are also the group of bacteria that are most closely related to the ancestor of our mitochondria. So our mitochondria are ancient endosymbionts. They were once free-living alpha proteobacteria, just like chloroplasts were once ancient free-living cyanobacteria. So Rhizobium can fix nitrogen. They live in root nodules on legumes, which are that's the bean family. That includes clovers, soy, green beans, peas. Those are all legumes. And they can make their own, some people say legumes make their own fertilizer because they have these symbiotic bacteria, these Rhizobium bacteria that live in these root nodules and fix nitrogen for the plant. So as long as the bacteria are available in the soil, a growing seedling will allow these to create these root nodules and live in there. So they both benefit. The Rhizobium gets sugar from the plant, and the plant gets fixed nitrogen from the bacteria. There are other nitrogen-fixing organisms in the soil that don't form root nodules, and some are cyanobacteria. There are even a few species of archaea that can do this. Fungi are really important. Almost all plants today, 95% of plants today, form associations with fungi. And myco means fungus, and rhizo, again, here means root. So a mycorrhizae, that just means fungus on roots. That's all it means in Greek. And this association is ancient, and it is essential for most plants. So the mycorrhizal fungi, there's not a huge number of species in this group. The number of species of fungi total thousands, maybe tens of thousands, and the number of species of fungi that form these mycorrhizae is a few dozen. So it's a very small subset of fungi that can do this. It's not just any fungus. It's particular species of fungus that can do this. So the mycorrhizae penetrate the roots. They help the roots take up water and minerals more effectively. The plant provides the fungus with sugar, and the fungus helps the plant to absorb nutrients. They also protect the root from other soil pathogens, from harmful bacteria and other fungi that would want to just eat the root. And they also weirdly secrete growth factors that help stimulate root growth. And we do know that if you grow plants in sterile soil in a laboratory that's lacking these mycorrhizal fungi, they just don't grow very well. And many of our crop plants are dependent on these mycorrhizal fungi. We think that this association is very old because some of the oldest known plant root fossils have evidence that they had mycorrhizae in them. So here's two of the oldest known fossils. And of course, these are very thinly sliced, and then they look at them under the microscope. It might surprise you to know that you can slice rock thin enough to make it translucent so that you can look at it through the microscope. But we can see in these little root cells, there's evidence that inside of these root cells are these mycorrhizal fungi. So this association is very old, and many scientists believe that it was essential for the very evolution of land plants, that without this early association between those early land plants and fungi, excuse me, there wouldn't be the land plant diversity that we have today. So there are two basic types of mycorrhizae, and they're named according to how deeply they penetrate into the roots. They both penetrate the roots. The ectomycorrhizae, which this is only 10% of plant species use ectomycorrhizae. Ecto means on the outside or on the surface. So the fungus, most of the mass of the fungal hyphae is on the outside of the root in these. Some of the hyphae do penetrate between the cells in the root, but that's not where most of the mass of the fungus is. It's mostly coating the outside of the root. So here's a little root tip here where you can see all these nice hyphae on the outside. So only 10% of plant species have that kind of association. Most of the rest of plants, 85% of all extant plant species today, use arbuscular mycorrhizae, which used to be called endomycorrhizae because they penetrate the root much more completely. They form these little branched structures, these little branched hyphae inside the root cells, and that's what the where arbuscular came from. This is from the Latin word arbuscle, which means little tree. You can kind of see the root in there, arbor, which means tree. So you can see these little fluffy branched fungal hyphae inside of the root cells. And this is a much more penetrative kind of symbiosis here, and that's in fact what most plants have, and that's what we see in those fossil roots, is we see this kind of mycorrhizae, arbuscular mycorrhizae, where you see branching structures inside of the root cells. 5% of plants don't use mycorrhizae at all. And it's thought that this is a secondary loss during the course of evolution, that these plants lost their ability to form mycorrhizal associations during the course of evolution. And many of these plants have kind of weird habitats, like they're epiphytes or something. And it's just not that easy for them to form association. They're not in contact with soil, so it's hard for them to form soil-based associations. So let's talk about some other weird kind of plant nutrition. We'll talk about epiphytes. So epiphytes are plants that live on top of another plant. They're not harmful, but it's not a mutualistic association either. So those other associations that we talked about with the Rhizobacteria and the Mycorrhizal Fungi, that's a mutualistic relationship. Both organisms benefit. But in the case of epiphytes, the organism that they live on, usually it's a larger plant like a tree, the tree is neither harmed nor benefit. So those are commensal organisms. We'll talk about parasitic plants, which parasitize other plants, and carnivorous plants, which eat mostly insects. So an epiphyte, of which there are many, many types of epiphytes from different groups, even ferns like this one, the staghorn fern is an epiphyte. So an epiphyte is considered a commensal organism. So a mutualistic relationship means both organisms benefit. A commensal relationship means only one benefits, but the other one isn't harmed or benefits. So in the case of the epiphytes, they live hanging off of another organism, usually a tree, and they're not harming the tree in any way. They're not tapping into it for nutrients. They're just hanging on it. So that's considered a commensal organism. Parasitic plants, so a parasitic relationship, that means that one benefits and the other one is harmed. The parasitic host is harmed by the parasite. So parasitic plants are only parasitic on other plants or their mycorrhizae. They're not parasites on animals or any other kind of organism. So a parasitic plant still has to get its nutrients, so it needs to get water, it needs to get carbon dioxide based photosynthetic products, so some of them photosynthesize, some of them don't, and it also needs to get all of those minerals that most plants get from the soil. So there are different types of parasitic plants. Some of them can photosynthesize and they just get minerals and water from their host, and others don't photosynthesize at all, like this snow plant here, which is native to California. It it doesn't even have any leaves. It does not photosynthesize. It's completely dependent upon its host for water, for nutrients, and for minerals. So the parasitism has evolved independently many, many times, at least 40 times. Most parasitic plants are eudicots, but there are some monocots and even some liverworts that are parasitic. So the definition of a parasitic plant is one that gets something, water, minerals, or sugars from another plant, from tapping into that other plant. So mistletoe, you've all heard of mistletoe probably. Mistletoe is a parasitic plant that is still photosynthetic. So it parasitizes trees and it taps into the xylem and of the tree, and it gets water and minerals from the tree, but it's still photosynthetic. So it gets its own carbon dioxide, it makes its own sugar, but the advantage, why would this evolve? It evolved because the mistletoe, instead of growing tall to compete for sunlight, it just rides up high by taking advantage of a much larger plant like a tree of some kind. And they're very easy to spot in the winter, which is probably why ancient peoples noticed them and they became associated with winter solstice celebrations, because when the rest of the tree's leaves fall, the mistletoe is still green. Dodders are very common. If you saw a dodder, you probably wouldn't even recognize that it was a plant immediately. They're not photosynthetic, so their stems are orangish, yellowish. They have no leaves. They just have stems and flowering structures. And this is this orange vine here, viney looking thing, that's the dodder. So the dodder can't photosynthesize, so that means that it taps into its host and gets everything from the host. It gets sugar, it gets water, it gets minerals from its host. Another type of parasitism is, instead of tapping into a plant directly, instead there are parasitic plants which just tap into the mycorrhizae of another plant. And there are quite a few in this group. This particular one is also native to the west coast of the United States, called Indian pipe. It's a monotropa species, and it's related to that other one that I showed you on the previous slide that was kind of pinkish. This one just doesn't have any pigment at all, but this is the stem with the flower on it. So they produce seeds, but they're not photosynthetic. Now, how could something like this evolve? Well, we do know that occasionally parasitic plants appear by mutation, and sometimes they're called Chlorophyllus or albino, which albino is actually a misnomer because we just mean that they're lacking chlorophyll. So Chlorophyllus is more descriptive. And here's a picture of one here. This is a redwood, a sequoia species that is, all the leaves are completely white and it has no chlorophyll at all, but it's a living tree that's, many years old here. It looks like it's at least a 10-year-old little tree there. So how is it surviving? Well, it has to be getting nutrition from the other trees that are around it, and it's obviously not tapping into them directly. Instead, it's going through the roots. So this particular type of a spontaneous parasite is tapping into the mycorrhizae of the other surrounding trees that are the same species. But you could see how this, during evolution, could eventually, if this tree manages to reproduce and has seeds and produces more Chlorophyllus offspring, that we could have a new species here that's a parasite of the other species of trees. So that's how, Chlorophyllus plants appear regularly. They're kind of rare, but they do appear regularly, not just for trees, but for all kinds of plants. They'll occasionally see one that has white leaves and is clearly, parasitizing some other plant in order to grow. Because they do still require sugar They can't make it if they're not photosynthesizing though. So we can see a little, like the first step in the process of a parasitic plant evolving, because it happens enough that, you know, people have always noticed these occasional albino trees. Sometimes they're called ghost trees or ghost plants because they're white, but they're not dead. They're very much alive. Carnivorous plants. So carnivorous plants are trying to get nitrogen. If they cannot get nitrogen from the soil, they can get nitrogen from animals. And they digest them just for the nitrogen. Because carnivorous plants are photosynthetic. You can see the sundew here has nice green leaf underneath. It can photosynthesize. They're not getting sugars from their prey. They're getting the nitrogen from their proteins. And they tend to live in, parasitic plants tend to live in places where the soil is poor and is low nitrogen. Like you can find them in many rainforests and also in swampy, marshy areas where it's somewhat acidic, and that makes it harder for plants to get nutrition. These are 3 common types of carnivorous plants. Probably Venus flytraps are the most familiar. They have modified leaves here that have little hairs that can detect pressure. And so when an insect walks on them, they close up rather quickly. And then they slowly digest the insect alive and absorb their nitrogen. Mostly it's going to be ammonia because it's amino groups from amino acids. Pitcher plants have syrupy digestive liquid inside, and they have hairs, slippery hairs that only go one way. So insects are attracted by the sugary liquid inside, and when they fall in, they can't climb out because it's slippery and the hairs all point downwards. And then they're slowly digested in a puddle of liquid down at the bottom. Sundews are really pretty, and the insects stick to the, again, they're attracted by a sugary liquid, and they try to eat the little droplets of sugary liquid, and instead they get surrounded. The leaf slowly closes around them, and digestive enzymes are secreted, and it's the same thing. It's mostly insects that are trapped by carnivorous plants, and the nutrient that the plants are trying to get from them is nitrogen, not calories, nitrogen, because they're all photosynthetic. They're getting all of the carbon that they need from carbon dioxide and the energy that they need from sunlight. What they're lacking in whatever environment they're in is nitrogen in the soil. This is another weird kind of carnivorous plant. It has these weird modified leaves, and when insects crawl in here, they get trapped. This is a scanning electron microscope view of one of these little bumps on these modified root-like structures. And once they get in there, just like in the pitcher plant, they can't get out, and they are slowly digested inside of these rolled up modified leaves. So, and again, for nitrogen. So here's a little video of a sundew plant capturing its prey. There's a sundew with a sticky, attractive nectar. Poor little inchworm. it might take a few days for our carnivorous plant to digest its prey. There, I think that's the end. Okay, so that's the end of this chapter. So in this section, we talked about the importance of nitrogen-fixing bacteria, the ones that are in the soil and also ones that live in root nodules, the Rhizobium species that live inside root nodules of legumes. We talked about the Mycorrhizae, the fungi that are associated with plant roots, and that most of them form these, are the arbuscular mycorrhizae that form these special types of structures inside the root cells. And that's 85% of plants form those types of relationships. And then we talked about epiphytic plants, which are not parasites, they're commensals. And then the three different types of parasitic plants, the ones that are photosynthetic, ones that are not photosynthetic, and ones that are actually parasitizing the mycorrhizae of other plants, not the plant directly. And then we talked about some of the different kinds of carnivorous plants, which again, carnivory in plants is about getting nitrogen, one of their important nutrients.